Good evening. Welcome to 12 Gauge Investigative. I'm your host, 12 Gauge. Tonight we continue on in the podcast with the Israel Keys story, Hunting the Hunter. We're going to start off with Cassie Emerson. The deaths of Marlene and Cassie Emerson were devastating on their own, but the way their lives ended, the unexplained violence, the advanced decomposition, the eerie timing, created more questions than answers. And without a clear method of killing, investigators were left to guess at the motive and the monster behind it. The trail had gone cold, but not before one name began to surface again and again. His name was Israel Keys. The quiet boy from Colville had grown into something darker, a young man who had already begun to unravel from within. He had spent years perfecting his detachment, testing limits, and escalating. He was the type of predator who would hide in plain sight, take what he wanted, and vanish without leaving a trace. He was already practicing, but who was the first? That question haunted investigators long after Keys was captured. When pressed, Keys would only smirk. He knew what they were looking for: the first body, the first crime scene, the first real trace of the darkness he'd eventually come to embody. But he refused to give it. The Keys, that name, the first victim, was too valuable. It wasn't about closure or confession. It was about power, control. That name was his alone, buried deep in the twisted treasure chest of secrets he guarded until the end. Julie Harris, Cassie Emerson, the victims in the shadow of his youth. Their cases were already complicated. Weather, time, remote terrain, decay. All of it obscured the truth. But some believe the truth is there, scattered across his old haunts in Colville, hiding beneath the ashes of the trailer, frozen in the silent woods where their remains were found. And somewhere in that silence, maybe still echoing, is the name of Israel Keys' first kill. The world may never know it, but he does, and he made sure to take it with him. The Girl on the River. Israel's disinterest in the family's faith had become more than just a phase. It was a fracture that ran deep. He no longer bowed his head during prayers. He no longer echoed their strict beliefs. And in a household built on obedience and fear of the outside world, that made him a problem. The once favored son had become something else. Distant, cold, unyielding. But still, they kept him close. John and Heidi might have disagreed with his path, but they never pushed him away. Not fully. Truth was, they needed him. With so many mouths to feed and no solid walls around them, his real strength, his silence, his work ethic, all of it made him invaluable. To cast him out would have weakened the entire unit. So they tolerated him, and over time, tensions cooled, at least on the surface. But even as the family held together by necessity, they didn't stay put, not for long. Of all the remote towns and forest clearings the Keys family called home, Moffin was the briefest. A stopover, a blip on the long road of survival. The younger children would barely remember it, just another night, under canvas, another place to be forgotten. But for Israel, Moffin marked something much darker. It was there, tucked in the quiet edges of the Des Shoals River, that he would later admit to committing his first true crime, the kind that shed blood, the kind that changed everything. The family's camp sat near the riverbanks, not far from one of the rocky beaches. Israel would later claim he could see the beach from the place where he worked, a stretch of land with few eyes and fewer questions. In the colder months, the place was dead, quiet. But once the summer sun began to rise, the visitors would come. Kids, teenagers, campers, wandering souls looking for escape in the wilderness. He watched them, from a distance at first, then closer, always studying, always waiting. He said the idea just came to him one day, not like a thought, but like a hunger. It wasn't spontaneous. It was something he fed slowly, with each passing glance, each moment alone in the trees. Moffin, for most, was a blip, but for Israel Keyes, it was a birthplace. The place where fantasy crossed out into the line of reality. The place where the mask first slipped off, not for anyone else to see, but for him to fully accept what he was becoming. Driven by a hunger he could no longer deny, Israel returned to the river, not to swim, not to fish, not to even watch. He came to wait. He found a spot among the undergrowth, buried deep in the brush just off the banks, where the trees offered cover and the river's hum cloaked his breath. This was his element. It reminded him of Colville, the cold silence of the hunt, the anticipation, the stillness. But this time, he wasn't stalking deer. He was hunting something far more human. If Israel Keyes had any standout trait, it was patience. The kind of patience that borders on unnatural. He could go for hours without blenching, barely breathing, eyes fixed on a single patch of land. It wasn't just discipline, it was instinct. The trait had made him a good hunter back in the woods of Washington. Here on the Des Shoals River, it made him dangerous. And then eventually, she came, floating lazily down the current, carried an inflatable inner tube, young, unaware, alone. Israel shifted. How he got her out of the water is still unknown. He would only ever say he did it discreetly, a word that sounds benign, until you realize who's saying it. There were no screams reported, no witnesses, just a gap in time, a missing thread in the timeline that no one noticed until it was too late. His plan was methodical. He would take her, drag her into the woods, far from sight, and do what he had already imagined 100 times before. Rape her, kill her, dispose of where no one would think to look. But something changed. Rather than vanishing into the trees, Israel took her to a second location. Not random, pre-selected. A place he'd already scoped out in detail. An outdoor restaurant. Remote, abandoned, isolated. Exactly the kind of place where screams wouldn't carry, where walls wouldn't talk, and where time had no meaning. It was there, in that cold cement shell, that Israel Keyes made his transition from hunter to predator, from fantasy to reality, from human to something else entirely. In his own words, the structure wasn't just remote. It was an outhouse, a crude, decaying stall of concrete and wood, rarely cleaned, almost never used. It sat just far enough from where the girl's friends were floating that they wouldn't hear her scream even if she tried. It was, as Israel put it, the perfect place for his first real crime. Inside the suffocating box of filth and silence, he tied her up. What followed was not only brutal, but according to later confessions, very violent in nature. A sexual assault that crossed every imaginable boundary. But his plan hadn't stopped there. He intended to kill her. That was always the end game. To end her life, leave no loose ends, and disappear back into the woods with the satisfaction of control. But things didn't unfold that way. He had envisioned. He had imagined terror, sobbing, pleading, the kind of raw fear that would make him feel powerful. That was what he expected. What he got was conversation. The girl didn't cry, she didn't scream. Instead, she talked to him. Through trembling breath, she began to ask him questions. Not out of curiosity, but something more primal. Survival. Are you from around here? She asked. Do your parents live nearby? It disarmed him. Israel, who prided himself on control, suddenly found himself unsettled, distracted. What are you doing out here? She asked. Why are you doing this? He couldn't focus. He couldn't maintain the headspace he had constructed. Then the moment that broke it entirely. You don't have to do this, she said softly. We could date. I probably would have gone out with you. That line, that manipulation of empathy, that shift of power, cut through his calculated intentions. She had taken the script from his hands and rewritten it in real time. The predator didn't feel in control anymore. And so he stopped. He didn't kill her. Instead, Israel untied her and let her go. She survived. He didn't give her name. He never would. And to this day, the survivor's identity was remain hidden in the shadows of his past. But for Israel Keyes, that encounter would become the blueprint, not of success, but of what not to do. It was a lesson, not in mercy, but in failure. And he would never allow that kind of failure again. It was too late by the time Israel realized what she was doing. Her voice hadn't been desperate. It had been deliberate, calm, calculated. She wasn't just stalling for time. She was humanizing herself, threading a needle through the one part of him that wasn't fully dead yet. Her questions weren't random, they were surgical. Every word carved a crack in the wall he had built around his conscience. And it worked. He began to see her, not as an object, not as a nameless thrill, but as a person, a girl, breathing, crying, alive. She had made herself real, and that ruined everything. The moment was broken. The fantasy unraveled. Control slipped through his fingers like river silt, and with it, the courage followed through. Defeated, Israel gave up. He walked her back toward the riverbank, saying nothing. He helped her into her inner tube, pushed it gently into the current, and watched her float away, back toward her friends, back toward safety, back toward a world that would never understand how close she came to death. She had survived, but Israel Keyes was forever changed. That failed murder didn't scare him off. If anything, it refined him. He knew now what had gone wrong. He'd let her speak. He'd let her inside his head. That wouldn't happen again. It couldn't. In the aftermath, Israel began to reshape his understanding of who and what he really was. He'd grown up in a home soaked in religious doctrine, good and evil, heaven and hell, God judgment, and Satan temptations. But after Moffin, none of it made sense anymore. There was no devil whispering in his ear, no divine test of will, no curse. The urge to harm wasn't planted in him. It was his. No outside force made him want to hurt people. No darkness possessed him. He simply liked it. And that truth, raw, undeniable, became his foundation for everything that would come next. No more hesitation. No more identity. No face, no name for the victim. No conversation, no distraction. Just purpose. Pain for its own sake. And in the still silence of the chaise, as the girl vanished downriver and the wind moved through the trees, Israel Keyes made a decision. He wouldn't fail next time. No one in Keyes' family noticed anything different. Why would they? Israel had always been quiet, withdrawn. If anything, he seemed calmer now, more focused. He did his chores, kept to himself, and said little about where he'd been. But inside, something had shifted. He'd come to the edge and turned back, not out of mercy, not out of fear. He'd simply lost control, and he hated that. It gnawed at him in silence, fueled his determination to never let it happen again. As for the girl, her name was already fading. He believed she'd had told it to him during one of the desperate efforts to connect, to humanize herself. But the memory was gone within days. He hadn't cared enough to hold on to it. She was a loose end, but one buried in silence. She never reported what happened. There were no police records, no witness accounts, no whispers in the papers, nothing. To Israel, that said something dark. He suspected that what she had experienced that day, that brutal, invasive violence, wasn't new to her. It was a theory he admitted later, almost with indifference. He thought maybe someone else had hurt her before. Maybe that's why she hadn't screamed. Maybe that's why she had tried to talk her way out instead of begging. It wasn't strength. It was familiarity. And that disturbed him. Not because he felt guilt, but because it made her story harder to track, harder to prove, harder to anchor to reality. She disappeared back into the world like a shadow into the woods. Her identity even now remains unknown. She is a survivor without a name. a ghost in the beginning of a timeline drenched in blood, and she would be the last person he ever gave that chance to. Breaking away. Just as the family had begun settling into their new lives in Oregon, digging roots into the forest floor, building routines, surviving in their usual off-grid way, the Keys' parents decided it was time to move again. But this time it wasn't a short leap over to the next ridge. They were heading near clear across the country. Malone, New York. A quiet, snow-covered town near the Canadian border. In the mid-1990s, its population barely touched 13,000. Small, isolated, conservative. It was the kind of place where people grew up knowing everyone's name, and strangers stood out quickly. For the Keys family, Malone represented another reset, another place to vanish into. But for Israel, it marked something entirely different. He was growing tired of movement, tired of being uprooted just when the ground started to feel familiar. But he was also growing stronger in his silence, more committed to his internal world than the one around him. He didn't argue with the move, he just watched. By now, he'd already begun breaking away in small, deliberate ways. He was no longer bound to his family's faith. He no longer looked to his parents for guidance. Their rules, their sermons, their fears, they didn't apply to him anymore. While his siblings followed the path laid out in scripture and survivalism, Israel drifted sideways, off trail, into a world of his own making. When they arrived in Malone, the town was blanketed in winter, and it suited him. There was a stillness in the snow, a kind of muted quiet that made people mind their own business. Israel took advantage of it. He explored back roads, vanished for hours at a time, worked when needed, and planned when no one was watching. Malone may have been just another town for the Keys family, but for Israel, it was a staging ground. He had tasted violence once. He had felt what it meant to hold another human life in his hand, even if only for a moment. He had learned what worked and what didn't, and he had made a decision. Next time, there would be no mistake, no conversation, no second location, and no survivor. Throughout the decade, Malone grew steadily, though not dramatically. A few new stores, a handful of houses, the quiet crawl of rural development. But for the Keys family, who had spent most of their lives isolated in the woods, even modest growth must have felt overwhelming. Compared to the tent life in Oregon, in the deep wilderness of Colville, Malone was a city. By now, Israel was an adult, and despite everything, the unspoken distance, the ideological divide, the emotional scars, he still held out hope for repairing his fractured relationship with his father. Perhaps it was a habit, or maybe he still sought, somewhere deep beneath the darkness, a sense of approval. Whatever the reason, John Jeffrey seemed, for once, receptive. He handed off a plot of land to his son, a quiet parcel near the Canadian border. Israel took it and wasted no time. He built a cabin there by hand, simple, isolated, exactly the way he liked it. It was the first time in his life that he had something entirely his own, a place untouched by his siblings, his parents, or their shifting religious philosophies. When he wasn't helping the family with odd jobs or construction work, he lived there, alone, self-sufficient, and increasingly unreachable. So when his parents announced yet another move, this time to Smyrna, Maine. Israel didn't follow. They said it was to get closer to the Amish, a purer life, a return to the older ways. But Israel had seen enough of their religious reinvention to know it wouldn't last. This wasn't the first time the Keyes family had veered toward a new faith, and he was done playing along. He stayed in Malone, planted, still, watching. Meanwhile, the rest of the family drifted into the edge of the Amish society, never quite belonging, never quite converting. They attended services, traded goods, learned the rhythm of maple syrup production, and adopted the local customs as far as their pride would allow. But they remained outsiders in a community that valued total conformity. That wasn't a problem for them. They were already experts at hovering on the fringe of society. Living off the land was second nature. They didn't need electricity, didn't rely on stores, and barely interacted with outsiders. But in Smyrna, their isolation deepened. The children grew up cut off. The outside world blurred into myth. Technology was something they observed, but not used. But Israel, he was different now. He had spent time in cities. He had lived around people. He had hunted both animals and once a person. He knew what the world offered beyond trees and prayer and silence. And he knew without question that he didn't want to be like them. While his family clung to the idea of the purity, Israel Keyes was quietly practicing, perfecting his calculated evil. He read, he watched, he planned. And deep in the cabin, miles away from anyone who might stop him, he began crafting something new. Not faith, not repentance. Strategy. The Keyes family lived as it always had, on the fringes, off the land, off the grid. Minimal modern technology, no luxury, no structure beyond the family unit, and the ever-changing pool of spiritual extremism. Their failure to fully integrate into Amish society wasn't publicly discussed, but to those who knew them, it wasn't hard to guess why. The likely reason was Heidi. She'd always been drawn to high-control religions, but her loyalty never lasted. What began as strict devotion often unraveled into disinterest, boredom, or ideological fatigue. The Amish, with their rigid codes and separation from modernity, had seemed appealing until they didn't. She lost interest before the family could ever fully cross the line into that world. And Israel Keyes, who had spent his life being dragged behind the erratic compass of his parents' beliefs, had finally had enough. Unlike his siblings, he wasn't content living in a theological limbo. He needed stability, structure, something they didn't have and that didn't change with every move or mood swing. Despite a homeschool education that barely scraped by conventional standards, Israel was sharp. He absorbed knowledge quickly. He taught himself to fix, to build, to plan. Alone in New York, in the stillness of Malone, he began preparing for his next step. He took a few community college courses, earned his GED, and set his sights on a goal that was as ironic as it was deliberate. He wanted to join the Army. It wasn't just a career decision, it was a quiet rebellion. While his parents shunned the government, preached self-reliance, and spoke of the end of times, Israel made his way toward the very institution they feared most, the U.S. military. Organized, structured, rigid, with everything his childhood had lacked. He didn't talk much about his motivations, but those who later studied him saw the pattern clearly. First, he rejected God. Now he was rejecting the Keyes family code. It wasn't rage that fueled him. It was resentment. And beneath it all, a cold, calculated sense of identity forming. He didn't just want freedom. He wanted control over what came next. And in the military, he saw something useful: training, discipline, access. A place where he could disappear into the system and emerge with the tools to become something far worse. And this is where we'll stop tonight. I hope you enjoyed the reading. Tune in next time when we continue hunting the hunter, the Israel Keyes story. Once again, I am 12 Gauge, your host, and you've been listening to 12 Gauge Investigative. Thank you so much, and please keep coming back. Till next time.